Today is Monday, December 19th. This is the Policy Committee meeting, and we're going to be concentrating on the 800 level policies. And I'll just share my screen. Okay. All right, so it's nice to see everyone, and we'll get started. We have a number of policies that are under solicitor review in the 800s. We are not bringing those forward to the board today for your interest in moving forward to the full board. I just want you to know that these are 800 level policies for which we've received PSBA guidance, but we are continuing to have conversations among our internal administrative team and with our solicitor. Records management, we have a few questions on that specific policy. And we're also looking at our administrative regulations and making sure that we've got some clarity on what should be in the policy and what could be in an AR. Both the new school bus drivers policy and the new school vehicle drivers policies, we have some questions around maintenance workers. And so we're waiting for some feedback from our solicitor on that because maintenance staff are not addressed in either of these new policies. So we'll hopefully bring them back to you at a later date this winter. And then we have a new conflict of interest policy where we're just double checking some items around statements of financial interest and the procedure for investigations. So we've asked the solicitor for additional information. And then we actually did get some clarity on the safe to say. These are procedures and don't actually need a policy themselves. And so we're likely to just drop that off the list, but we do have the solicitor confirming for us that what we currently have in other existing policies satisfies all requirements around safe to say procedures. Are there any questions about these 5 areas?
Yeah.
All right, so this second group, the second agenda item, sorry about that, it's taking a moment to shift for me. These are all new policies that we want to approve as recommended. And what I think might be easier for me to do is actually work through, sorry, my computer, there they are. If you take a look at this total list, I'll go into the draft policies one at a time. But this entire list, we feel absolutely ready to recommend them as approved by PSBA. We did not need solicitor input, and we feel like we're in very good shape relative to these policies. These are all new policies through PSBA, so they're not replacing former policies. And so we're going to go into the 800 level. Sorry for the delay here a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to start with 800.1. Electronic signatures. And so because these are all new policies, you're not going to see, as you have in former policies, where there's been minor changes, you're not going to see anything in bold per se. The entire policy is new. So if you take a look at this, and I apologize, I'm having a little trouble with the technology right now. Essentially, what this policy is requesting is that we have procedures in place to make sure that we are managing the electronic signatures of any staff members who are signing documents for us. So primarily this would be central office administrators. And so there's some guidelines here. The one thing that we did cross out, and we did confirm this with our solicitor, is that we don't necessarily need to keep a log of the unique electronic signatures of each member of the team. Any questions on 800.1?
I guess I just had a quick clarifying question. Is this coming out of the cybersecurity training, or is it informed at all by any of the language from that? I was just curious.
Do you mean, Sarah, from just cybersecurity concerns in general?
I may have misunderstood, but I thought that there was like more trainings happening for staff on cybersecurity. I was just curious where the impetus for this one is, and then more importantly, just like, does it align with sort of best practices or standards from other places?
Sure. So it's our understanding, both through PSBA's review, Jillian Chick, as well as from Jen Hanlon, that yes, this does follow best practices. Under that purpose there, I can't presume that this is in its entirety, but what they're sharing with us is obviously the idea that they want to make sure that we have appropriate financial measures in place to secure our resources. Ms. Green, is there anything else you would say about that?
No.
Okay.
I think you covered that well.
Okay. All right, so 800.1, then the next one, 802, is just letting us, having a policy that identifies what is the grade organization, the grade band organization for each of our schools. Fairly straightforward. And there are on occasion times when we actually have to file reports relative to this. Any questions about school organization? School calendar just clarifies when and how we will determine our calendar. And as you know, last year we approved 3 years in advance. So it's our intention this winter to bring forward the 2024-2025 calendar for review. And we can always update our calendars at any time if we feel the need. But it's nice for families to be able to have, as much advance notice as possible. And this essentially just clarifies that we'll do that. Any questions about this policy? Okay. And then school day, very similarly, just asks us to clarify for the community, what is our school day? I do think that both school calendar and school day may very well have come out of the pandemic, and interest in there being clarity with the community about when and how we meet. You can see there's a statement in here that we can consider things like illness, urgent reasons, and other circumstances for the school day. Okay. And then 805, emergency preparedness and response, Steve Chinta reviewed for us. This policy really clarifies the necessity for regular drills and assessments. We are absolutely in compliance with this policy, but it does also allow for the board on an annual basis, as we have been doing, to receive a Safe Schools report. Last June would have been the last time you would have received that presentation and report. It also requires that we have an MOU with the local police to make sure that we're clear on how we're going to have joint response in emergency situations. So essentially, it guarantees that each district will coordinate with local agencies as well as state agencies where appropriate. There are some districts where state police are in the jurisdiction, and essentially allows us to make sure that we're training and communicating as we're supposed to. Are there any questions about this policy? You can see here the safe to say procedures is an attachment within this policy. So earlier when I mentioned items that were under solicitor review, we just wanted to have an extra layer of review prior to bringing any procedures forward. So by the time we meet with the board on the 17th of January, we will have the procedures. Any revisions will be embedded within there. All right, next is 805.1, relations with law enforcement agencies. And again, the goal here is to make sure that we have an effective, efficient relationship with our local police and any other regional agencies that we would need to in order to ensure safe schools. So we have an MOU that every other year is reviewed and then board approved. The next board approval for our MOU with the police will be this coming summer. So we approved an MOU with them in June of 2021. So we'll be due this spring for an updated review. And essentially what that document provides is guidance on what are the mandatory areas of collaboration where the school district must report to local police, refer matters to local police, and then what are the areas of discretion. And so as an example, recently the chief of police and I had a conversation about fights on campus. Should we or should we not involve the police? And that's a discretionary report. And so we regularly communicate in order to make sure that we're in sync as to what we expect and what they expect. There's also a comment in here about students with disabilities and making sure that the police have an understanding of students with special needs and how that can play into some disciplinary situations or need situations on campus. And then we also have the Safe Schools report, which, as you know, we provide annually. And prior to that, the board has notice. We also provide that Safe Schools report to our local police, and they have time to review it and ensure that they agree with our reporting before it goes to the state and then ultimately to the federal government. Are there any questions on 805.1? And then 805.2, school security personnel. This essentially requires that every district have a safety and security coordinator, which, as you know, we've had in place for some time. And then what are the responsibilities of that person? And so we have verified. The only thing that we modified here in green is you'll see that we clarified what our title is in the district for that position. So who is the person who is ultimately responsible? And then everything else in here, we have verified with our team that we absolutely do. We made one other minor change. School security personnel, instead of shall carry weapons, I changed that to may, because we have had conversation as a board and as an administration about the fact that we prefer that our security personnel do not carry weapons. And so I wanted to change that shall to may. Hopefully that agrees with your thinking on this. And then at the bottom, we just have to clarify what is our agreement procedure. So we enter into a cooperative police agreement. That is our MOU. So we don't actually have school resource officers in the same way that some other districts do. They're not actually members of the police force. So you just have to clarify those agreements. Are there any questions on 805.2? Okay. All right. 807, opening exercises and flag displays. This is a fairly straightforward, I think, reinforcement by the state legislature that they would like to make sure that we are pledging allegiance and having the national anthem on a daily basis. And what happens if students decline to recite the pledge, which is, I think, pretty clear here. And then it also allows for a brief period of silent prayer or meditation. We don't actually do that in our district, but we don't have a problem in theory. If we wanted to do that, we could do that. Are there any questions about this policy? Okay. All right. The next one, 808, food service. This is a little bit less intense of a topic. It essentially just manages who's responsible for food services in the district and the extent to which we are complying with state and federal guidelines on the kinds of foods we serve, what we charge, etc. And in our district, that falls under the business manager, Ms. Green's responsibility. So Sam Janko, our ABA, is the person who manages food services. In some districts, it may be one of these other titles, but in our district, it's the business manager. So we just highlighted that. And then we just confirm our process for free and reduced meals, how we communicate that to the public and how we report, accommodating students with dietary needs, how we manage accounts and balances. And so you'll see there, I think fairly straightforward. There are two items that we are just identifying for ourselves. One is that we're going to make sure that we have an oversight of the food service operation and compliance identified with the business administrator. So in other words, we're just clarifying that we're doing everything in this list. And then the second is that we want to develop procedures for payment of school meal accounts. So Ms. Green will be working with Ms. Janko on an AR that goes along with this to help building administrators know what to do in specific instances. For example, non-payment, and what are we feeding children if their account is in arrears, etc. Are there any questions on the food services policy? Okay. All right. Excuse me. So 811, I'm going to skip. There's other two that I mentioned we were going to hold off on until later. So 811 bonding is a new policy that essentially allows us, and Ms. Green, you're probably going to do a better job than me on this as far as what this policy highlights.
Sure. So this just identifies that there's certain employees that need to be bonded. That would be myself, Ms. Janko, myself as the board secretary, Ms. Janko as the board treasurer, and then our tax collector also has to be bonded. And then under our insurance policy, there is not a bonding, but there's a crime premium that we have that basically protects staff, so the administrative staff and the board. So, but this identifies that anybody that is required to be bonded is bonded. That's what the policy is stating.
Thank you. So are there any questions about this policy? Okay, it's a lot of new policies, I know. The next is property insurance. And again, Ms. Green, do you want to sort of give a summary of why this is coming forward?
Sure. So this basically is a policy that the board is basically adopting to say that we are putting proper or adequate insurance coverage in place to protect the district's interest. So not only is that auto insurance, general liability, just like I said, there's crime prevention. We also have a cybersecurity policy in the event that we were cyber hacked. So this policy is just saying that we have adequate coverages with a certified insurance company.
Thank you. Any questions about this policy? Okay. And then other insurance. Again, we had a question mark. We actually went to our solicitor about, do we really need another policy? But this is sort of like a coverall around if there's any other insurance that we will provide it. Ms. Green, I don't know if there's anything else that you want to highlight in this, but essentially our solicitor said, yes, it can't hurt to have the policy in place.
Yes, the most, I think the biggest one in this, and it is identified here, that any insurances in our CBAs or collective bargaining agreements, or employee handbooks, which is our health insurance or voluntary insurances, it's just the catch-all of covering any other insurances in place with the district.
Make sense? Any questions? This is a very dry set of policies. I apologize. There we are. All right. 822 is a new policy on AEDs and CPR equipment. So interestingly enough, several years ago, you may or may not recall, we really increased the number of AEDs on our campuses, their proximity to gymnasiums as well as to lunchrooms. and then to have them in various areas of each of our school buildings and to make sure that we had trained staff in each building. So this policy, I think we're ahead of the curve here. We have been ahead of the curve, and we continue to be in really good shape. We check these as part of Mr. Chinta's review and Mr. Thorne's review. All of these AEDs and CPR units are checked on a regular basis to make sure that if we need new batteries, we order them, make sure that they're in good working order, and that we have staff trained to use them. Are there any questions about this policy? Okay. All right, and then this is a little confusing. So you can see that there are two 828s, an old and a new. I don't know why they chose to use the same number for these two policies, but we're going to be late on a later agenda item retiring old 828. So I'm going to look at new 828, which is fraud. And this policy essentially exists to make sure that we are, as it says here, because we're entrusted with public funds, that will make sure that people are not committing fraud. Ms. Green and Ms. Kara, I don't know if there's anything else you would want to highlight in this. I think it's a fairly straightforward new policy.
Nothing to add.
Any questions? This is one of those where I think, do we really need a policy? Isn't it obvious that we don't expect people to commit fraud? And yet, here we are. The only thing that we modified is we just said that you don't have to review and approve any fiscal irregularity. That's our job to do. That's something that our auditors do and Ms. Green does on a regular basis. And then we made a minor change down the bottom as well, that it's superintendent or the board, if it's about me, in consultation with legal counsel if there's any concerns around fraud. So it essentially establishes the process in the event that there is a concern. Are there any questions about those two modifications? Okay. All right, and then the last new policy is 830. And this one, Mr. Oliver reviewed for us. And this one, you know, as we mentioned earlier, definitely with new cybersecurity threats and that being a focus. We have here with the increased reliance upon electronic data, the purpose of this policy is to make sure that our maintenance of that data is very clear and that we have processes in place if we believe that we have a breach in security. Essentially, the board would be allowing our administrators, which would start with Mr. Oliver and myself, to provide appropriate notification if we believe we've had a breach. Are there any questions about this policy? And Mr. Oliver's on the call as well, just to make sure if you had any questions around this one. I know this is a hot topic right now in districts because of how many districts have seen security breaches.
And all of these you said have been reviewed by PBSA, so this is the best practice. Same question I had before. Okay, great.
Yes, absolutely. So part of what we contracted with PSBA's representative, Jillian Schick, to do is review every one of these policies that have come through, make sure that it is as current as it can be. And you'll see in a minute, even if it's within a few months, if there's a change, we're going to make that change. And then where we felt we needed solicitor review on top of it, or where PSBA recommended solicitor review, and that's in the cross-reference documents at the end of the section, we have had the solicitor review. And then there are occasions where things are unique to individual districts. And so, for example, who's responsible for food services, then we actually provide that specific modification to the policy. All right, so I'm going to go back to the top and I'm going to go to 801. So the next agenda item is revised policies. So these are policies that we have on the books in the district, but we've received revisions as recommended by PSBA and or our solicitor. And so you'll see those recommendations within the policy in bold, any of those changes, not the definite, you know, the defined words there, but any of the other bold-faced words are recommendations from PSBA or from our solicitor to clarify the policy. Okay, so the public records policy, these are very minor changes. But you can see here a little bit with regard to written requests. So they'd like to make sure those requests are in writing and not verbal. And then they're clarifying regular business hours in the guidelines of the administration offices so that they want to make sure that they're being as clear as they can be about when you have access. And then how to request access, they've provided some clarification, and fees. I will tell you that this one specifically has to do with right to know requests. The increase in prevalence of right to know requests, particularly during the pandemic. And so this just clarifies for the public how best to make those requests and when they can expect to get a response. Are there any questions about this policy? Please don't hesitate if you, I know right to know requests happen frequently. And so, you know, we always refer right to know requests to our solicitor for their review to make sure that we're in compliance with the timelines as well as with the content of what's been requested. There's never a right to know request that doesn't run through our solicitor. Okay. And then you can see here if we deny a request, what's our timeline for that, et cetera. So this just clarifies that. All right. Okay. Scroll down to 806, child abuse. Again, Dr. Lotz reviewed this policy to make sure that this follows what our current practice is, and obviously we would amend practice to meet with the policy guideline. And so we've confirmed that. We also have an AR relative to this, that following the board approval, we'll amend the AR to make sure that we're in compliance. And so you can see here, there are several modifications to this, specifically around the form of sex trafficking and trafficking, unfortunately, as a result of increased prevalence in that area, not in Springfield, but nationally and even globally. So you see those two modifications under perpetrator, being explicit about the forms of trafficking. And then the other adjustment is down here at the bottom under guidelines. And so they're looking for us to increase, in particular, how we communicate, ways to combat child sexual abuse and child abuse in general. And then under the guidelines, added a whole section on aiding and abetting sexual abuse, again, around the concerns of trafficking. These other areas, as you can see, have very few changes, just clarifying areas of responsibility. And Dr. Lutz, I don't know if there's anything else you'd want to comment on with regard to this policy.
No, just to add that all district employees are mandated reporters. And so if we suspect, we do have to report to children and youth through childline reporting.
Are there any questions on this policy? Okay. All right, so we'll go to 810, transportation. This policy, Mr. Bray is here for. And I'll just work my way down. You can see there is significant changes to transportation policy. And Mr. Bray, I don't know if there's anything that you want to sort of summarize or highlight in regards to these changes.
I would just say, for the most part, these changes are things that we're already doing. It's just that this is updated language, and some of it drawn right from the letter of the law in different areas of law. But it's really just bringing our policy more up to date. Nothing in here really goes against the things we're already doing.
Thank you. Are there any questions about this policy? everything in bold is reworded or new. And so it is, but thankfully, as Mr. Bray said, the first thing we do when we get these reviews is confirm what are we already doing? To what extent are we already in compliance with the draft policy? And then what, if any, changes need to be made to our administrative regulations to come into compliance once it's board approved? Okay. All right, I'm going to continue then. 814, copyrighted material. So again, with the prevalence of online resources, Dr. Johnston, who isn't with us tonight, but she actually reviewed this policy just to make sure that our communication with staff around materials they may use in classroom instruction and administrators and materials they may use in professional learning opportunities, that we're in compliance. So we feel very comfortable with this policy, but did want you to let you know that because of the prevalence of online resources, things like teachers pay teachers and free online resources, I think that's the impetus for this policy coming into being. Again, it's a revised policy, but it's largely changed and reworded. Any questions on this policy? Okay. So I mentioned earlier that sometimes we have a policy that we approve and then we get a revision relatively close to that. So we approved this policy 815 in July. And upon a second review, there was an interest in adding a few minor changes. And so you'll see here that it's in coordination with the Director of Technology. That simple change to clarify language, our solicitor felt was relevant. And you see that several times, that it's in coordination with the Director of Technology. So it's not just the superintendent, but also the Director of Technology who works in this area of acceptable use. So we're going to bring this forward again, even though we just approved it in July, to make that minor change. And then 815.1, website development actually kind of went away. So I apologize for that. They absorbed 815.1 in 815. So it's okay, that's covered. So I'm going to take that off the board agenda when we meet on the 17th of January. And then contracted services, 818. Ms. Kerr, you're probably the best person because you work with this all the time. You want to talk a little bit about this policy?
Sure. So this is just anyone who we are contracting with as independent contractors or through an agency to deliver services in our district, and defines who has direct contact with children, what that definition means. And then under the law, independent contractors or contracted services have to follow the same background checks as employees do, employment history reviews, and then even training, and they're still mandated reporters as well. So this really details all the things that they have to follow, which helps us in formalizing and adding these things and following through with our contracts and making the contracted companies do all of these things that they're required to do.
One of the things we talked about is that it really helps us to share the burden with these agencies. So we're not the only ones responsible for verifying that this information, these pre-history steps have been taken. It also allows us in future contract negotiations with agencies to ensure that this is happening. Are there any questions about 818? Okay. 819, suicide awareness, prevention, and response. So this policy is not new, but you can see that there's a number of revisions to the policy. And Dr. Lutz reviewed this with our clinical team and made sure that we are in compliance. Dr. Lutz, do you want to speak about this one?
Sure. We went through the policy just to make sure that it captures not only best practices from some of our research-based resources in terms of how do we respond both when we become aware of suicidal ideation in students, and then also when there is a completed suicide and we need to respond to that in a timely fashion as well. So we have recently done updated threat assessment and suicide trainings for our staff members. So those are captured in here with some of the verbiage that we've been trying to use across the district to make sure that we're all speaking the same language. And then in addition, we'll do updated administrative regulations that follow along with this to make sure that all building administrators and members of our clinical team are using the same handbook, so to speak, when we have to deal with a student who has expressed some type of suicidal ideation.
Are there any questions about this policy? I know it's very timely for us. We have a policy 818 or 819 already approved, but you can see here that there's a number of revisions to the policy just to bring us up to date. And following the board approval, and frankly, concurrently, Dr. Lutz is in the process of reviewing our current administrative regulations to see what, if any, things we need to do in order to make sure that we're coming into compliance with this new policy. Or these new policy revisions, I should be clear. Are there any questions on 819? Okay. And then 823, naloxone, I'm probably mispronouncing that, but unfortunately in this day and age, with regard to concerns around opioids, this policy is in place. It's not a new policy, but it's a revision to clarify expectations as far as the administration of naloxone, if there is an interest in actually having that on site. Dr. Lutz, do you want to speak to this at all?
Sure. So it generally goes by its prevalent name, which is Narcan. And we do have it on site at both the middle school and the high school. We actually receive it free through several grants that we're able to apply for. And this would just be if we suspected that a student or a staff member or anybody who's on campus may have overdosed on some type of illegal substance, we could administer this, and then we would immediately call for ambulance assistance.
Are there any questions, Ms. Hughes?
And I'm sorry, Dr. Lutz, if you said this as part of this already, but who is it? Just the school nurses that are trained in how to administer it, or are there other staff that are also trained?
Right now, we just have our school nurses trained. I believe our athletic trainer was trained as well, but during the school day, just the school nurses.
Thank you. All right, so there's a very minor change you can see to the majority of the policy, but just wanted to make sure you had seen that. Okay. So that's the end of the revised policies. And then the last agenda item is on policies to be retired as recommended. So school bus idling. The summary here is that it's already in 810. So we don't have to have a separate 810.2. Okay. Then the next is 817. Electronic signature, because everything's been moved into 800.1. 818.1. So there's two policies, 313 and 818, under which these are believed to be covered. It's very close to the old policy 828 as well. And so you'll see below that 828 is also recommended. And we did have our solicitor review that just to make sure. Old 828, sorry, because there's two of the same policy number. Okay, so in retiring this, you can see here in bold that this is Jillian Chick saying she's going to resubmit 626 to us. And I mentioned a few minutes ago that as policies, if there are updates, we'll continue to bring them forward So we'll bring forward that 626 to you in the future. And then the last one is 820, bloodborne pathogens. And this one is now covered in two policies, 203.1 and 314.1. And again, this goes back to a different age when HIV was much more unknown to people. And so it's been revised at this point. And then I just wanted to mention to you, there are several other policies that we had already approved. So we mentioned 815 and 815.1. Policy 816 was already approved. We had done that early. And so if I go to, I have to come out of this. If you go to new policies, 816, 824, and 832, you'll see them in the cross-reference, but they're also, we had already approved them earlier this spring because we felt that they were time sensitive and we wanted to get them in front of the board. So I'm going to go back, assuming this will move relatively quickly, to our policy committee meeting. And those are all of the policies that we would bring forward on January 17th. Again, if the solicitor review of those first few policies is completed in a timely fashion, then we may ask for you to review those 4. But right now we're still waiting to finalize things with the solicitor. Otherwise, we'll wait for a future board meeting beyond the 17th of January. So I'm just looking to see, are there any questions?
Dr. Yannick and Dr.
Yeah.
Lutz, I have a question, and it probably goes back to more the suicide policy and in light of like what has just happened. And to communicate to the students about a student's death, you know, my boys mentioned like it was announced on the announcements. Is that part of that policy?
That would be not policy, it would be our administrative regulations.
Okay.
And Dr. Lutz is in consultation. We have a consultant, Terry Erbacher,
Okay.
who we work with. There are 3 ways that, or 4 ways that that information can come out. It can come out
Okay.
over the public address by the building principal.
Mhm.
It can come out by being emailed to classroom staff and then asking classroom staff to deliver that message.
Okay.
It can come out via student email,
Okay.
or it can come out via family email and then have
Okay.
families share with students. The challenge for the administrative team at any building and district administration, with the prevalence of social media and the speed with which information is now shared, is trying to determine the most appropriate and most efficient way to do so with a caring voice. There are debates about whether public address by a building leader or classroom teachers is more effective and supportive of students. Our concern around the email and asking building staff to deliver that message was reviewed with our clinical team.
Okay.
And our feeling was that, for example, in a most recent incident, we had 8 substitutes in the building. And so to have someone who is a familiar voice share that information at one moment, knowing that all students are hearing the same message in one voice at the same time, was preferable to us.
Okay.
To taking a chance on when people would feel comfortable to share that and the extent to which they would feel comfortable. So,
And again, it's not that I think there's a perfect answer to how to communicate that information. I certainly do not think that.
yeah.
I was just, since the policy came up, I was curious if it was a part of the policy or like how that gets determined. So you answered that for me and I appreciate that.
Yeah, that would be in the administrative regulations.
Okay.
Not the policy. I mean, in theory, the board could establish policy, but we're hopeful that we can continue to have.
No. And again, I don't want to micromanage what you as a administrative team decide to do.
Sure.
You know, hopefully you don't have to do it again. So it was because it came up in this meeting, it was more of a curiosity of how that gets determined. So
Absolutely. It's an ongoing debate among school administrators everywhere.
right.
You know, what is the appropriate method for communication and timing? And that whole system has changed in the age of social media.
Right.
So,
And I also get putting that information in the hands of people who don't feel prepared to share it is like a whole other, like I said, I don't think there is a right way.
yeah,
It was
I
more of a
understand.
curiosity. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that would fall under administrative regulations.
Okay. Got it. Thank you.
And as I indicated, because this policy is up for a review and renewal, and because there is so much that has been added to the policy and guidance, Dr. Lutz will be working with the clinical team to amend our AR, or administrative regulations, to make sure that we're in compliance with best practices at all times. Okay. So we're up to the guidelines for public comment. I don't know if we have anyone, Mr. Oliver, here from the public. I can stop share for a minute. I can see better. Let's see.
There is no one in the attendance list.
Okay. All right. So is there anything else that either of you would like us to be looking at? We have a few of the 800 level policies left, and then the 900s, and we will finish this cycle of mass review. And then we'll just be getting into, as updates come from the federal government or the state, we'll just be bringing those forward in a timely fashion, probably on a quarterly basis after we get through this large review.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate it. And I'll be happy to share with you, if you don't mind, sometime in the next few days, or at the latest, the first week of January, we'll share a summary for you.
Okay.
And if you guys can draw straws and tell us who would like to do the board report on the 17th, that'd be great. Okay.
Sure, I'll do it this time since you had to give a report last time if you want.
I don't care either
Okay.
way. And honestly, I know some people prefer not to do it, but I don't mind
Okay.
if
All
you
right.
have strong feelings about it.
I don't really have a huge preference, so yeah.
All right. Well, we'll send it off to
You
you. And then
battle
we
it
can
out
check
when
in.
it's closer to the meeting.
We'll see how you feel in January. We'll
Yeah,
send out the notes, and then you guys can just let us
Right,
know.
decide.
All right. Thank
Right.
you very
Thank
much.
you, everybody. Bye.
All right.
Thank you all. Take good care.
Happy holidays.
Yes.